If you come up to a super jack bodybuilder at the gym and you're trying to get some keen, real specific insight as to why he's jacked, something he knows at some high level must be there for him to look like this. And I'm here to tell you that the answer is no. Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, and today's topic is about how to explain why some people are fitter than others. And specifically what the top 3 most important factors are that determine how fit someone has gotten and how fit someone can get. To be less technical, here's the example. You look at someone in your gym and they're like a super fit, like figure girl, or they're like a really jacked bodybuilder. And you wonder to yourselves, like, how come that's not me? What's different between the two of us that person is super ultra fit in whatever way you define fitness? And why am I not as fit? What is the difference between us? And more specifically, what can I do about my own body to get as close to that as possible? Is there a secret that person is doing? Is it the shoes that they're wearing? They're sponsored by a weightlifting shoe company. Is it the straps that they're using? Is it the specific program they're on? It's an RP template. I heard those are good. Is it the supplements that they're taking? It's the kind of creatine. I've literally had people ask me, people that were way, way charitably out of shape, what brand of creatine I use. I know the logic that occurs behind the scenes for that question to pop up into the imagination. And that implicit logic is that guy is 5'6", 250 pounds with veins because of in large enough respect for me to ask the type of creatine that he is using, which is a preposterous idea that's just not true. So what is it that separates myself from folks less fit than me, or much more common circumstance, other jacked, lean people from regular folks, let's say at the gym? Why are they so fit? 2 caveats that explain a ton of the variance, but there's not a whole lot to say about them in the context of this presentation specifically, is first genetics and second drugs. If you see someone that's really, really, really jacked, they probably have good genetics for it, and they've maybe taken drugs. If they're ultra super psychotic jacked, they've probably taken drugs. Those things work. Genetics is a huge thing. Drugs do their role, so that explains a bunch. But drugs are not something we focus on this channel. Plenty of other great channels where you can get that kind of info. And genetics, for the time being, you got what you got. Hopefully in the 2030s, we'll have some genomic engineering, and then you can fucking just code in whatever you want, which will be amazing. But until then, you just sort of have the genetics you have. Well, what about stuff you actually can change? You wouldn't come up to a pro bodybuilder and be like, hey, how do I get your genetics? That's nonsense. Hopefully, if you have any sense of propriety, you wouldn't come up to a pro bodybuilder at the gym and be like, hey, where do you get your drugs? What kind of drugs are you on? It's kind of a strange question to ask, being that they're illegal and at the very least frowned upon. But you may come up and start asking them details about their training program, about their diet, et cetera. And let me tell you, starting from that vantage point, how the rest of that expectation of a conversation should go. Your expectation for the reality of what it is they can tell you and how you can expect it. Because if they're real smart, maybe they're not. They'll tell you basically the next 3 things, and here they are. The number 1 factor in getting as fit as you can be is to get the basics correctly, even roughly correctly. What do I mean by the basics? Here are some examples. Relatively good technique, at least technique that stimulates the target muscle trained relatively close to failure with relatively heavy weights. Sets anywhere in 5 to 30 reps. As many sets as they can recover from, and no more than that chronically. Any kind of technique that stimulates the back, the chest, the shoulders. And it's not that hard to figure out stimulus. You're like, oh, my pecs are burning and I feel the tension. Great, good enough. Doesn't even have to be perfect. If that is something they're doing, that gets them well on their way. If they're training between their minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable, and if they're getting weaker over time, that's above MRV. Most people don't do that intuitively. They get so systemically fatigued psychologically, they'll just stop training for a few weeks, feel better, and then ease back in. Deloading, or taking some time off at least when the fatigue gets too high. If they're doing that, that's a big deal. If they're not, they're probably not very fit. They're eating something like high protein meals at least 3 times or more per day in the context of a generally healthy diet. They're in a surplus when gaining. If you see someone who's 280 pounds and jacked, they've probably been in a surplus or 2 before, is all I'm trying to say. So on and so forth. And you'll notice that this is the end of the list. The so on and so forth doesn't get into any more minutia. It's just examples of other big rocks. Like they get decent sleep, for example. That's really all that's kind of left over. What you'll notice is people can do a lot of wrong stuff in here. I mean, your technique could be atrocious. Your training plan organization can be awful. The specifics of your nutrition can be terrible. But as long as you're doing these fundamental basics, you can be really jacked. And here's one of the reasons I even wrote this PowerPoint to give you guys this video, this lecture. If you come up to a super jacked bodybuilder at the gym and you're trying to get some keen, real specific insight as to why he's jacked, and you notice that the technique isn't even good, and you asked him about nutrition and he just said, yeah, like a lot of protein, bro. You're like, something he knows at some high level must be there for him to look like this. And I'm here to tell you that the answer is no. I'm here to tell you they can become enormous and jacked and lean if you have good genetics. Sometimes if you take drugs, and even with drugs, it's like they might not know a lot. Just take lots of drugs and they fucking work. Yeah, the side effects will be nasty, but you're not really noticing those if you don't have an astute eye for it. Sometimes genetically, they just get the lucky card. They don't even get a whole lot of side effects. And so when you're coming up to someone who's really jacked and you want to know, like, what is this insight that you have? They might not have insight, is what I'm trying to say. Just challenging the body decently over time works. And speaking of time, factor number 2 is how long they have been at it. Very few people look very impressive or perform impressively after a year of lifting or running or swimming or playing tennis or whatever. It's just not enough time. The people that are very, very good at it generally have been at it for 5 years or more. If you train hard for 5 years, you will at least look like a very different person than you were before you started training. Train hard for 15 years and have decent genetics. Do the decent normal shit right. Eat well. Train like some semblance of progressive overload, which happens automatically if you're egotistical anyway, because you're just like, I feel like lifting more, and then you do it. You will leave almost everyone else behind because almost everyone around you has not dedicated 15 years of their time to getting fit. They just haven't, and they won't. Time is the big deal here. And so when you look at a jacked bodybuilder and you want to walk up to him and ask, how did you do this? What's the secret? One of the secrets is that he's been lifting since 15 years ago. And then, gee whiz, it's not really a secret. It sounds like I'm trying to get you to not walk up to bodybuilders at the gym and ask them like, hey, how did you do this? I'm just trying to get you to understand that before you walk up to them, know the landscape that I'm talking about right now so that you have a better question for them other than so what's the secrets? Like I've literally had people be like, they come up and they're like, it's protein, right? You eat a lot of protein? I'm like, yeah, it's the protein. And they're not that far off because it really is some basics like that go a long way. But other people will ask like, so what kind of periodization scheme are you doing? And here's the thing. That's a great question when they're already getting the basics right themselves. But a lot of times people aren't getting the basics right themselves. Like they've been lifting for 1 year, not consistently. They don't eat enough protein. And they're like, so do you like progressive overload? Or are you doing like DUP? Never mind, the nomenclature there is all wrong, which it almost always is when they ask you. But I just kind of want to yell and scream at the top of the mountain. It doesn't matter for you yet. That is not what makes me me. If I did stupid bro training, high intensity, in it, United Kingdom Dorian Yates style training, I would fucking be very close to as jacked as I am now, just like significantly more hurt or whatever. But I would have been very jacked because it still meets the criteria of training hard with the basics for long enough time. And lastly, in the time of training, you can say, hey, like, when did you start training? And someone would be like, yeah, like 15 years ago. But they don't look very impressive. And you're like, oh, I must just have bad genetics, which factor number 3 is worth a mention. And that is, how many retrogressions have you had in the span of your training career? Okay, you've been lifting for 15 years, but for a few years here and there, you might have fallen off completely and just done nothing. That happens all the time to people. You sure as shit won't be as fit as you would be if you trained consistently for 15 years, because some of that time, maybe much of that time, was spent regaining the lost gains you had lost from not training for as long as you did. Now, the bright side here is that the regaining happens a lot faster than you think. And even if you didn't train for 5 years out of a total sequence of 15 years, you end up getting almost as jacked as you would with 15 years of consistent training. Not almost, but closer than you would think. But if you have a lot of layoffs, they add up. And this is a bit of a mini tragedy in my experience with the gym world and gym culture, is people who, when they train for a few years or a few months hard, they go hard, they put all in. Their lives are organized for training and diet. And then they disappear for months or years and don't do anything. And you look at them 10 years later and they're just not very impressive. And they're sort of like struggling. And they're like, man, I just want to get really in great shape. And I'm almost like, yeah, but you can't just quit all the time. You can't do that. It's the consistency that's key. Within the time span of how much you were training, 15 years of training, what have you been doing that time? I've actually, this happens in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu all the time. I'll roll with someone and I'll be like, hey, like, what's your belt rank? And I'm like, blue, but like, they're like, but I've been rolling for 6 years. And I'm like, oh man, that's like a purple belt. That's like a brown belt. And then you roll with them and they suck. And then inevitably after the roll, in many cases, they will tell you, well, like, I haven't really been training all 6 of those years. Like, sometimes just once a week. Sometimes like I'll go a couple months without rolling. And I'm like, I can tell. You don't say that, but you can tell. So same way with any kind of fitness, being right with the basics, training for a long time, dieting for a long time, and never falling off the wagon too much or for too long. Couple of weeks here and there, no worries. Couple months here and there, you're behind. Couple of years here and there, and it's not going to be so impressive. That's the stuff that makes you 85% of as fit as you could have been. The exact periodization scheme, the exact details of your diet, et cetera, that's all layers on top, but that's not what determines most of the meat and potatoes. Give that some thought. And if you want to hear more nerdy stuff like this, we'll see you in our members area. We get extra videos every week, usually on more in-depth topics. And the Team Full Round Forum, you can ask me personal questions in there. You get tons of diet and training. Work with the whole team. It's a great forum environment. Ask any question, it gets answered. That's also in the description. Like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you next time.